I think it's always a very special event with a forum and for many in the evening the pre-Galien. It in some ways allows us here to meet and discuss progress in an important area of medicines. And we usually take a holistic perspective from science to patients to stakeholder to access. Today we have a very distinguished panel representing remarkable contribution from both the patient foundations, academia, and several of the companies that have transformed the type of promise we see in this field from being scarce opportunities in treatment of obesity to dramatic change in the outcome, at least in the shorter term outcome. So here we have, let's see, at the left side, Lee Kaplan from, you have been with the Harvard medical community for many decades and been a pioneer in building both preclinical translational models, thinking about the patients that initially benefited, particularly from bariatric surgery. And I know now you have decided to move to an even more famous college, Dartmouth. We have Stephen Gough here, who is Global Chief Medical Officer from Novo Nordisk. And, oh, here.
I'm here.
You're here next to me. Stephen has a long, prestigious career at Oxford as a physician and scientist dealing with endocrinology, diabetes, and also obesity. And you will hear some sharp Oxford English. Then we have a number of other key stakeholders. Joe Nadglowski here, who is President and CEO for the Obesity Coalition. And I know from getting to know you just briefly that you have been a patient advocate your entire life from leaving college and joined the opportunity to advocate for obesity patients early, long before we had this change in opportunity for their life. And then we have from Lilly, Dan Skovronsky. Dan is a physician, scientist, neurobiologist originally, and an entrepreneur from the biotech industry that joined Lilly a number of years ago. And under Dan's vision, Lilly have made remarkable inroads in using peptides with multiple specificities to recreate a more favorable metabolic signaling through the peptides that can allow dramatic improvement in both diabetes and obesity. And then we have the company that have collaborated with the Novo Nordisk sitting next to me, that is Søren Tullin. I know you have had long collaborations, and you also collaborated with Lilly on empagliflozin. So you are a collaborative company, Boehringer, and you come from original Novo Nordisk and have taken on the leadership for obesity research in Boehringer. So we have an amazing panel that transits so much experience, and at the time point when the promise in obesity has gone from being very vague to be extremely powerful. And why is this so important? Well, we are on our way over the next decade to have about 4 billion people worldwide being overweight or obese. So it's kind of a growing pandemic that is going to be impacting maybe even more than the COVID pandemic did. And a couple of years ago, the estimate was that 38% of the world's population were either overweight and obese. And that is unfortunately growing to be above 50% before the ascent of this new treatment. It was estimated to be 50%. There is an opportunity to change that, and we will discuss it. So what we have seen is that a new class of medicines that was originally tried in diabetes called incretins, GLP-1, and many of you that are not dealing with medicine in the daily work may have heard names like Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. And these are very powerful mechanisms that when dosed at higher level usually than in diabetes have been reported to lead rapidly to body weight loss of 10-15% over months to a year, sometimes even more. And you know, the typical question when you see an old friend, an old colleague, and first don't recognize him and her is, are you on one of these new obesity miracle drugs? And interestingly enough, most will answer proudly, yes, I am, because it's having really a life-transformative experience for them. And why is obesity so important to address? Well, a number of years ago, when we dreamed about maybe 5% body weight loss through medical intervention, it was seen as a disease with either lifestyle or lack of willing power of the patients to deal with it. We now have recognized that it is a disease with genetic drivers, multiple genes, that in combination with environmental factors make it very difficult for some to battle this disease over a lifetime. And as unfortunately we have become a more sedentary society where blue-collar hard work has been replaced by computers and hoodies, dressing style, we are increasingly seeing obesity happen early in life. In childhood obesity, and we see at teenage, adolescent, and early, like 30 to 40 years of age. So in the future, there will be a whole new spectrum of metabolic changes because people may have struggled with obesity for a long, long time compared to what we have been used to in the medical textbooks, where it was a small number of people and certainly happened for most much later in life when physical activity was more limited. So as we are at this crossroad with so much scientific progress, there still are opportunity to discuss how do we ensure patients are seen by all as patients having a disease of the same type as maybe a disease of an infection, heart disease, or psychiatric disease, that any disease should be seen as something that deserves the same type of intervention in society. So I start with then asking Lee and Joe, give their different perspectives as physicians or patient advocate, how you see the obesity patient now growing up compared to 10 years ago, and whether they have a better opportunity to step forward or whether they feel they have a stigma and have hesitancy to seek help.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start us off. And we can't talk about obesity without talking about the stigma of obesity, right? Somehow in making obesity bad, we've made the people like me who live with obesity bad as well. And that has real consequences. You know, we're living in this world of probably remarkable innovation that really could help people, but we've actually made it not okay to seek help for your obesity, right? You're told you should just be able to push away from the table and go exercise some more and solve this issue. And so we have to overcome that, right? We have to make it okay that me as an individual can go to my healthcare provider and have a conversation with them and say, hey doc, I'm struggling with my weight. Can you help me with this issue? And then my provider has to actually have received the training to actually know how to do that. Many of our healthcare providers have never received any training around obesity. They hear the news the same place you do, which is on TMZ and on Google and all that other stuff where all you hear about are these new medicines and the misuse of these new medicines by people who really, the society perceives they shouldn't be using them. But we need to make it okay that people who have obesity, which is having too much body fat that harms your health, right? This is not about cosmetics, this is about health, right? That they have access to these kind of medicines. And the system is just not set up that way. Again, my provider's not trained, and probably there's only about a 20% chance that my insurance would cover such therapies. So And we have to change that, right? That is, by the way, that's not just me convincing insurance companies and policymakers to pass laws. It's me convincing, although they're not the folks on this panel right now, but their bosses to price these medicines appropriately, et cetera, moving forward. But access is a major barrier, because I can convince people. We have a campaign. We convince people to go talk to their doctors about their weight. Guess what? Their doctor isn't skilled enough to have the conversation, or their health insurance doesn't cover what the doctor recommends, and it creates real barriers. So that's the challenge we're living in right now. I do, with that, sounding kind of negative there, I do have a lot of optimism that we're moving towards a better world, but for right now, it's a real challenge. So, Dr. Kaplan.
Sure. So being one of those doctors, I guess I can comment. But we're ignorant because nobody has ever considered that obesity is something we ought to consider. And think about it for a second. What makes it difficult to consider obesity a disease? I think the first thing is we confuse it. I'm looking around this room. There's very little obesity in this room, I'm glad to report. But I'll bet a lot of people in this room have tried to lose weight or have lost weight at some point. And the first thing we have to do is separate out, bright line separation between what I call the cultural desire for thinness, which is a cultural issue and varies from culture to culture, from obesity, which is a disease. I often say that losing weight feels good. Treating obesity can save your life, and now we have the data to show that it can save your life if you have obesity. So that's the first thing we have to do. And the second thing, the second question I would ask is, if we're going to take care of obesity, because it does cause all kinds of problems, why do we do it in the medical environment? Why not do it in a strip mall where we used to do it? And I would argue it belongs in the medical environment simply because the purpose of medicine is to relieve suffering. And suffering generally comes in two parts. It's the suffering of symptoms, and it's the suffering of fear of what's going to happen to you in the future. The development of complications, the death from complications. I'm talking about all diseases, not just obesity. So does obesity fit in that role? Yes, because obesity has symptoms. Unlike some of the other diseases we treat, like high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, diabetes in its early forms, kidney disease in its early forms, they don't have symptoms. But obesity does have symptoms. What are those symptoms? People are preoccupied with food. Some people call it food noise. They can't function because of that. Or they're always hungry, or they're never full. Those are symptoms. Or they don't have heart disease or lung disease, but they can't breathe easily when they go up a flight of stairs. Or they fall down and they get more damage. Nothing I'm saying has to do with a complication of obesity. It's the obesity itself that changes the shape of the body, changes the ability of the body to function. And if relief of suffering is what we should do in medicine, then we don't have to debate this subject further, because relief of suffering is what happens when we treat obesity effectively. Stigma is a real critical problem. It sits behind everything, but the relief of suffering can be the target of what we do if we're not defensive. The problem with us physicians in obesity is that we're defensive about the treatment of obesity, because we've been stigmatized. Not me personally. I'm too old for that. But people get stigmatized even if they engage in treating obesity. And so what you want to do is you want to be less. We were told, when I joined this field in mid-career, we were told that you should get permission from a patient, informed consent, to use a drug off-label. We don't do that in any other disease. 40% of all prescriptions in the United States are off-label, are written off-label. We never thought of getting permission, but we get the permission to do, we were told to do it. We were told you're supposed to ask permission to a patient to even talk about obesity. The nice thing about one of the nice things about being a physician is that you can talk about things that are inappropriate to talk about in public. Marital strife, erectile dysfunction, pick your choice. Obesity is the only disease that you're allowed to talk about in a cocktail party, but you're not allowed to talk about in the office. That's crazy. And so these are the kinds of things that we are faced with as the barriers. But if we focus on what it is that obesity is, which is something that makes the lives of people with obesity miserable and that we can help fix, then we win.
Thank you so much. And you alluded to that beyond the symptomatology, it's because it's not a silent disease. It's also leading to many life-threatening complications. And some of the companies represented here have contributed to show that aggressively treating obesity can have an impact on cardiovascular and kidney outcomes and be life-saving. So maybe we start with Stephen here and the Novo Nordisk pioneering studies that have been done and really showed that obesity can be a disease shortening lifespan considerably, and there are now medication to address it. And whether you could, Stephen, explore a bit, how do you think about these opportunities that you and industry colleagues have brought to the physicians, whether Lee and others, from a medical opportunity over 24 and let's say the next 2-3 years, and then we'll speak a little bit about the science a little bit longer, and then Dan can follow, and I think, Søren, you have in clinical studies some activities too. But let's start with Stephen here.
Yeah. So thank you. So I think it's been a long journey, and I think one of the things that one of our great scientists at Novo Nordisk would say to me, Lotte Bjerre-Knudsen, who was responsible for liraglutide, she often says she's frustrated when she sees the news these days, but it looks like we've now just jumped onto obesity, and we've just found that GLP-1 can help with this. But actually, that's what she was working on 30, 35 years ago. So this has been a journey where we knew GLP-1 receptor agonists had this potential. The other big part of the journey, which has really been touched upon by our previous colleagues, is that there's been a massive educational journey to be on. Even today, in many countries, obesity is not recognized as a serious chronic disease. We're now beginning to understand that it's a metabolic disease, that there's heterogeneity within that disease, and that one size will not fit all. And that in addition to the symptoms that Lee has talked about, it's associated with significant comorbidities. So to see medicines like GLP-1 receptor agonists not just now hitting weight, and it's not just about weight, it's about well-being and patients' lives, to see that we can now impact on weight. And for the first time, and I can't really talk about the results until the full study comes out later this year, we've now seen with semaglutide, at the higher dose, we've seen this 20% reduction in cardiovascular disease. And people said to us 5 or 6 years ago, you're mad for doing studies like this. Why are you doing SELECT? But I think we believed all along, and I know Lilly have as well, that this was something that was tractable. This was something we could do. And I think we've got to the stage now where we can show it's a chronic disease, it's a metabolic disease, it's heterogeneous, and we can do something about the outcomes. So we're at a very exciting time. Can't quite remember whether that was your question, but that's what I wanted to say.
I think you was absolutely in the right part of what I was looking for. But Dan, please continue. And you have particularly embarked beyond just being a fantastic contributor also in the GLP-1 field, but also combining peptides to tailor maybe to some of these different populations that we heard from Stephen. If you could share a little bit about that work.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Michael, for including me in this panel. It's great to be here. And, I think, as you've heard from the other speakers, it's such an amazing time in obesity research right now because we finally unlocked now multiple mechanisms that can really treat obesity, I believe, and then reduce all of these consequences of obesity that we know are medically important. As you've heard, we've seen studies from intensive lifestyle modification, which is really difficult and few people can comply with. We've seen studies from bariatric surgery. Now we've seen pharmacologic data that suggests when you reduce body weight in people who are obese, you can save them from all of these medical consequences like heart failure or other kinds of cardiovascular disease or liver disease like NASH. So it is this exciting moment, and as the science breaks open, we're finding multiple mechanisms that can be combined to influence this. So Lilly, for example, has a medicine that's approved for type 2 diabetes and under review for treatment of obesity called tirzepatide, which combines GLP-1, which is maybe the most widely known incretin, with another very important incretin called GIP, and finding benefits with those. And I think this is just the beginning. We're working now on a triple combination that adds in glucagon. And we think these different medicines could have different important benefits for patients, not just measuring weight, but also looking at the improvements in some of these downstream health consequences. I think that's important, and we need more and more of this health outcome data because our goal, as you were saying, is we have to destigmatize this disease. We have to understand it's a chronic disease that needs chronic therapy with serious consequences. It's not the first time that this happens in medicine. This happens from time to time, and these are like pivotal moments in medicine. Lilly was delighted to be part of this with psychiatry, and when we came out a few decades ago with Prozac, depression wasn't really seen as a disease, and it was something you could just get over. Now doctors can talk about it and treat it. I think we're on the verge of really seeing that kind of progress for patients in obesity.
Dan, since you have a neurobiology background, we often speak about the brain-gut axis, and many of these new medicines do indeed act also on the gut. So you have actually a system between the metabolic organs, the brain and the gut. Because you spoke actually about depression, and
Yeah.
so you have a lot of intersection. And where do you think the current medications are acting around these three typical target organs?
Yeah, I think clearly, just to level set everyone on incretin biology, these are hormones that are secreted by your gut to signal your body that you've eaten and you're full and it's time to process and store energy and stop eating. They work on multiple organ systems. We know there are receptors on the pancreas cells to secrete insulin, for example. We know there's receptors for GIP-1, at least on the adipocytes, your fat cells. We also know that these hormones, both of them in our case, have receptors in the brain. And I think all of these are important. Actually, though, when you talk to patients who are on any of these medicines, the first thing they tell you about is the food noise going away and this insatiable craving for food that probably non-obese people experience if you're fasting for a day or two. It's no longer a question of willpower when you see food. People with obesity are feeling that every day, and then they try these medications. And I think the thing they really note is a change in their brain well before they started weight loss.
Søren, any particular perspective you also want to bring to the table here, as your company from a traditional cardiovascular has made some successful inroads into the metabolic space?
Maybe I will start a different place here. First of all, it's great to be here. I remember when I was hired as a young scientist at Novo, one of the first things I was doing there was to do obesity research. And in those days, you were very often met with, well, obesity. Why are you doing obesity research? People can eat a salad and run a marathon and they're done with it. But that was what we were met with in these days. And it's really great to see these days that there's a growing awareness everywhere in the world that this is a disease with severe health consequences. I think that's really fantastic. It's also great to see now that we are getting the tools that allow us to induce a weight loss in people with obesity, but even more importantly, provide genuine health benefits to the patients. And here, of course, it's also great to see that there's a new generation of combination therapies coming out where GLP-1 is being combined with a lot of other, usually peptides, glucagon, GIP, NPY2 receptor agonists, amylin. And we have seen the first data now coming out of the trials for these new potential medications. And they promise, as far as I can see, a much more significant weight loss. But also, as you were alluding to, Dan, we will probably also see that these medications will provide different health benefits, different benefits to many of the obesity-related complications. Of course, coming from research, I also have to look a little bit into the future, if I'm allowed to. So And here I will look at some of the gaps, even though we have come a long way and it's really great where we are at the moment. It's also very clear that there are some gaps we need to fill. So the GLP-1 based medications might not be for everyone. People experience varying degrees of weight loss. They experience varying problems with tolerability like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and so forth. Another question is, how are these medications going to be used long term? I mean, now we see the first hint that people stay on these medications maybe for less than a year. And we know what will happen if they go off the medication is that they will quickly catch up. And that might negate the health benefits. And again, more experience on how that is working out would be really interesting. And then of course, there are other things. We also notice in the clinical trials that people not only lose fat mass, they also lose lean body mass and skeletal muscle mass. And that's not really what you would like. And then of course, it's a very heterogeneous population. We have people with BMI 30, 40, but even 50, 60 and above. And when you go to the really high BMIs, of course, it's also desirable to be able to induce an even bigger weight loss. So a lot of things to do there. And the way we try to approach it at Boehringer Ingelheim is that at the moment, our primary research focus will go beyond the GLP-1 based medicines, trying to find new mode of actions that could help with solving some of these problems. And we are not only interested in appetite suppression, but also in increasing energy expenditure. And by the way, also understanding the effect on the different circuitry in the brain, because it might not be as simple as these agents suppress appetite. So yeah, a lot of open questions and a very interesting future for the treatment of obesity.
So thank you for opening that door to what's next to come. And I really wanted to bring in Stephen and Dan and also Lee on that. You framed some of the remaining challenges, although we celebrate a big success with short-term rapid weight loss. One is the tolerability for the agents, particularly gastrointestinal, and I think in many studies, 30-40% of the patients quit relatively early. The other is maintenance for a variety of reasons, and I think Joe is well aware of this. It's hard to get prescriptions beyond a certain time, and unfortunately, 6-9 months later, many patients revert back to the original body weight. And then current drugs, most of them are injectable, and some patients feel that it's an intrusion in their life. A few companies, including Pfizer, Novo, and Lilly, have started to study oral drugs. I think Novo have even brought to the market oral peptides, remarkable intervention. And Søren wants to have a word after Stephen and Dan about oral drugs that could broaden the treatment from being seen as a specialized disease in hospitals to open up more primary care. So, Stephen, what do you think about this next wave of treatment goals?
So I think that Søren has identified and articulated many of the issues that we're now starting to think about. And I think that this is the area that we're now working on. I think we've reached a stage, and forgive me for saying this, where the magnitude of weight loss is pretty good. You know, we're in the realms, we're sort of getting towards the realms of bariatric surgery. But I think the question that we're really starting to ask ourselves is, what is the quality of that weight loss? What is the impact on other outcomes? What is the tolerability? How do we use these new, well, I say new, but how do we use incretin biology and beyond incretin biology in combinations so that we can so that we can address the heterogeneity of obesity or people living with obesity? So we know there's heterogeneity out there. We know it's metabolic, and we have a number of tools available. I think there's going to be new molecules coming along, not just what we're already thinking about, but it's about not just the magnitude of weight, but the quality of weight, the quality of the life that we can restore and bring back to people who are living with obesity, so that we can look at the outcomes and we can look at some of the adverse events and the side effects that you've talked to. So I think and how we do those combinations is also really exciting. I think the thing we've also learned in the last 12, 18 months, maybe even a little bit longer, it might be also important how you combine these therapies. Is it two separate injections or two separate medicines? Is it something that you can co-formulate? Is it something that's a co-agonist? Because I think these molecules behave differently, even though they might seem to be similar on the surface. And then, of course, maintenance. That's a question we're all thinking about. What is it we need to do now to maintain that weight loss that we see, as you say, so acutely? So these are all the questions that Søren has sort of highlighted that I think we're now working on.
Dan.
Yeah, hard to disagree with anything that's been said. I mean, I think the current generation of weight loss drugs and drugs in clinical trials are achieving life-changing levels of efficacy. I think in our last tirzepatide obesity trial, we had 26% weight loss, which is just incredible to think about. There'll probably be one more generation of drugs from Novo and Lilly and others that hopefully can even exceed that. But after that, it's probably not about more and more weight loss, for most people at least. There may be some who need more. It's about some of the other things, and I sort of think about it in two ways. One is as my colleagues have been saying, the quality of weight loss. What are the additional benefits that come along, whether that's liver or other organs that can benefit, or preserving or even improving muscle mass alongside weight loss is something we're working on. And then the other, Michael's, what you're getting at is just the patient needs for things that are convenient and widespread available and durable. That's a frontier that I think we're just starting to approach. You mentioned early on the global burden of obesity. I think by 2030 it could be close to 1 billion people around the world who need these kinds of drugs. And so if we think about a weekly injectable, 52 billion injections made every year, Pfizer and Moderna sort of showed us what's possible with the vaccines in a year. A couple billion doses were made. I don't think anyone can conceive of humanity making 52 billion doses of injectables. So we need orals to meet the global needs for obesity. And then we need things probably, and this is right now it's just a dream, but drugs that you could stop taking and maintain the weight loss. We don't really have that for any chronic diseases. We don't have that for blood pressure. We don't have that for cholesterol. I want that for every disease, including obesity. That'll be a big breakthrough if we can do it.
Søren, you seem to have some real exciting experiment in your lab. Anything you can share on what you're addressing?
I just wanted to make this simple point when you talked about orals, that this is also something that we, of course, are very interested in. I'm not so sure, sorry colleagues, I'm not so sure that maybe oral GLP-1s alone will solve it, because these molecules, at least the small molecules, they will have a relatively short half-life, and I wouldn't be surprised if that led to even worse tolerability issues for these molecules. That would be at least one concern I have here. So and the way we approach it is we want to look for non-GLP based mode of actions, because we think that could be the solution to better orals. So that's just the point.
Very exciting. Lee, when you look at this opportunity dosing with incretins, whether with one or two mechanisms, and you hear about orals is within the reach of the next few years, where would you point to additional needs for patients and physicians to get addressed?
Yeah. So I'm going to say one thing in response to that, and I'm going to disagree with some of the panel members about one other thing.
That's fantastic. We like a little bit of disagreement.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
bring it out.
So the issue, we talk about heterogeneity. We've talked about it multiple times, but the heterogeneity in obesity is actually quite enormous. I would argue that in addition to the 200 plus complications and associated diseases, there are probably 100 or more subtypes. And you say, well, what's the subtypes? Everybody has got too much fat. But not everybody has liver disease. Not everybody has kidney disease. Not everybody has food noise. Not everybody has excess hunger. there are so many subtypes and they account for this variability, which means that we're going to need complementary therapies. And those complementary therapies may only be to bring people up to the average of these new drugs. So they don't have to have 30% weight loss. Maybe they just have 10% weight loss, but they take care of a subpopulation. The thing I want to say that might be a little bit at variance with my colleagues in pharma is that everybody talks about, it's in the newspapers all the time, how do we do it so that we can permanently get the weight down? I'm going to argue that that would be the biggest disaster we could achieve, and I'll tell you why. If anybody in this room, either themselves or their family members, has ever been pregnant, you would not want to have a drug that made it impossible to gain weight during pregnancy. What you want is a drug that allows the body to regulate appropriately and responds to pregnancy by gaining weight appropriately and then losing weight appropriately at the end of the lactation period. And I say that because we have such a thing, and that thing is called bariatric surgery. When you undergo bariatric surgery, you lose weight and you keep it off until you get pregnant, and then the pregnancy overwhelms the bariatric surgery, and then you lose the weight at the end of the pregnancy. Do these drugs do that? A big question is going to be, can we run these drugs through pregnancy? Is it going to be safe? Is it going to be safer to run the drugs through pregnancy and let them act like bariatric surgery? Or is it going to be safer to stop the drugs, allow the woman to gain 40, 50, 60, 70 pounds back, then gain the weight of pregnancy? Which is worse for the fetus? And so I raise that just to say that body fat mass is regulated. It's not fixed. It's never fixed in life. Babies lose their baby fat automatically. Girls gain fat during puberty automatically. Boys lose fat during puberty automatically. We don't want to fix it. We want to fix its regulation, and that's what we do for most other diseases.
And Lee, since you spoke about the regulation of the system, are you concerned when we override it by very rapid weight loss, or would you like to see more physiological weight changes over a long time?
I don't know the answer because we haven't studied it. But what I would say is obesity is a disease like every other disease. When you're sick, of course, your body is not working correctly. When you treat it, you're not taking away the chronic disease, you're treating the chronic disease. So we have to be concerned that lots of things like decreased muscle, risk of gallstones, is caused by obesity, but then when we treat the obesity, we are maybe even making some of those things worse. When we treat the obesity, what we're doing is we are taking somebody who has obesity and making them into somebody who has treated obesity. We do that for other diseases. That's not the same. If somebody has a BMI of 25, high end of normal, that's not the same as somebody who once had a BMI of 40 and is now have a BMI of 25. It's a different pathway. And by focusing only on the weight and the shape and the size, we forget that inside the body, everybody with obesity has something wrong inside the body. It may have been caused by the food environment. It may have been caused by stress. And so the treatment we have to consider does not render the patient without obesity. It renders the patient as treated, and we have to take into account all those complications.
We would like to open up also for questions.
Here we go.
Me and Matthew, I actually worked in a lot of the top pharma here, but I've been helping startups, and I see, and I also help with multi-omics and looking at that space as well. But what my question is with GLP, although now GIP and GLP and the trizipidine with Eli Lilly, GLP has effects on the central nervous system or depression, anxiety. With Dr.
Kaplan.
Kaplan.
Kaplan. He addressed an important question there. Once you're off it, again, depression and all these things are side effects. With the GLP perspectives, are there a combination where pharma is starting to look at AI and looking at it at different modules where you could assess other areas of depression because it's not a one catch all. It's not just for weight loss. 30% now I hear is the maximum it's occurring. It's a long, like you said, it's a longevity of life. Or how do you see yourself as a prolongation of that?
You want to take?
Yeah, I can at least give it a shot. So it's quite certain that the GLP-1s are not only affecting appetite; they're doing more things. I mean, that's getting very clear from case studies and data that are coming from the literature. And at Boehringer Ingelheim, we have also CNS research, and we actually have a close collaboration with our CNS colleagues to explore exactly these non-appetite regulation effects on the circuitry in the brain. And of course, the ultimate goal is to understand how this works and come up with even better therapies. And we also try to understand how potentially the GLPs can help with some of the psychiatric diseases. So it's a super good point.
Right. Maybe add in, your question was about AI. I don't know about using AI to solve this problem, although there's another panel on that topic. But look, I think there's so many people now coming onto these GLP-1s and terzepatide combination incretin.
The applications, there's applications now.
Applications, yeah.
Oh, okay. So, anyways, there's so much data being generated out there that we can start to sift through that real-world evidence and see what kind of benefits people are getting. Tons of anecdotal reports, for example, around alcohol use or addiction. Novo is doing a trial on Alzheimer's disease. There's investigator-initiated trials on treating depression with these drugs. So we're going to learn a lot, just given the widespread use as we sort through that data and some of these clinical trials about some of the other benefits that hopefully this class of drugs can drive.
Please. Yep, at the back.
Thank you. A question around the gut-brain axis. You have discussed it. There is the other piece there about the symbiotic bacteria axis that is particularly complex and maybe very relevant to that point of being treated with obesity versus not having obesity. Any thoughts on that frontier? Because I know it's very open.
You're interested in a microbiome and its role. So it is,
And
yeah,
how you are thinking
very,
about that.
yeah.
Steve, I think that's for you.
Microbiome. No, I don't think that's something that, I think that's something that people have been exploring for a number of years. I'm not sure that we have a clear steer yet on the role of the microbiome. But I think there's an increasing opportunity as we, certainly within Novo Nordisk, as we're doing bigger and better trials and we're collecting more information to do multi-omics and also to collect samples so we can look at the microbiome. I think we will be able to shed more light in that area in the future, but at the moment I can't give you anything in terms of where we are, but I think there's the opportunity in the future to be able to address some of these questions.
If I could add, I just want to add one thing about microbiota, because it's talked about all the time, which is it's a great sensing system in the gut, senses the environment, and it's a great communication system, a regulatory communication system. There's no evidence yet that the microbiota causes anything all by itself. What it does is it transmits information mostly. And because of that, none of the studies that have been done to try to use the microbiome directly to fix obesity has yet worked. But it doesn't mean that some of the things that the microbiota does to activate certain genes, to activate certain immune and metabolic systems won't be great targets for the future. But I wouldn't put a lot of hope that the microbiota itself, that we'll be able to eat some yogurt of some sort and we'll end up getting rid of
You
obesity.
propose it could be a cofactor that improve response to certain
Or may even just reveal a mechanism like, Reg3G, for example, a mechanism that we know is involved in the regulation of body fat.
John.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the panelists your thoughts on the epigenetic imprinting that evidently happens when a person has become obese. You talked, Lee, about a person who's had a BMI of 40 and now is 28 or something is not the same as somebody who had 28 all their life, and just your thoughts around that, because it's well known, this phenomenon, that there's this resetting somehow of the metabolic rheostat in persons who have been obese at some point in their life, and it just wants to keep pushing them back to an obese state. So any thoughts around the opportunities for somehow altering that epigenetic imprinting that seems to happen?
I would say, from our point of view, it's something that we've talked about. It's something that we're looking into. I can't tell you anything in terms of where are we with it, but I can say that I agree with you. I think it's something that is likely to be having an effect, and probably a lasting effect. It's not quite the answer to your question, but I think what's really important, and I think Joe touched on this, is the importance, though, of treating people living with obesity early. The earlier we get in, the better. We know that children and adolescents living with obesity will become adults living with obesity. And we know that those people are the ones most likely to get the nasty complications, the cardiovascular disease, the comorbidities. So I do believe I think one of the opportunities we have going forward is to treat people earlier.
What seems to be an interesting aspect of your question, John, is whether it contributes to treatment resistance, and if you cannot reverse it, can you fully benefit? We had a question here.
Yeah, Kurt Rasmussen from Alex. You mentioned the stigma of obesity, thanks very much. It's the stigma of obesity, which is true and present. There's also a huge stigma around substance use disorders. And there's anecdotal evidence that these compounds can help with alcohol consumption and maybe even other substance use disorders. Are there any plans to look into treatments for substance use disorder, another population terribly affected by stigma?
Yeah, I'd happily start. It's such an interesting area, and I think there are a number of sort of investigator-led trials right now looking at these drugs. I don't know about any large sort of phase 3 type of clinical trials from pharma, but I would predict that's possible in the future based on that anecdotal evidence and, based on the deep unmet medical need, right? I mean, but probably right after obesity, we would put addiction, at least in the United States, as one of the most important unmet medical needs.
Worth acknowledging, too, there's at least one of the older medicines, not particularly old, but one of the non-incretin medicines to treat obesity is naltrexone bupropion, right? Naltrexone's used in addiction, right? So there's some other interesting pathways there, but there is already an existing medicine that kind of combines those.
We're soon approaching wrap-up, so I thought I'll turn back to ask Stephen and Dan, representing the two companies that have contributed to the big medical advance this far. Many companies, BI, Pfizer, and many biotechs that hope to join and broaden the opportunity to treat obesity holistically. But I'll give you the opportunity here to say, if we were sitting here by 2030, what would be the single sentence that you would like to say as a proud example on the most recent contribution that similarly altered the field that comes from your team?
I would say, I'd love to be able to say, we've bent the curve. Because if we get to 2030 and we have 1 billion people worldwide with obesity, living with obesity, we failed and the world's got a big problem.
Bent the curve, I liked it. Dan?
Yeah, reduced the burden of disease and improved life expectancy around the world. I think that's possible. We don't have all the data yet, but with treating obesity, I think people will live longer, and we'll start to see that, which would be incredible.
Thank you very much. And treating early, as we heard, making sure you treat before it becomes part of your perceived stigma. Like many diseases, once you have experienced them, they leave a mark. And I think 2030 we'll be able to say there is opportunity to treat before disease becomes a burden. Thank you very much for staying with us. Thank you to this extraordinary panel. And you can hear the great hopes for the next year with continuous advances. And by 2030, major breakthroughs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.